America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation, and today we're joined by Rachel Greszler of the Heritage Foundation. Rachel focuses on retirement and labor policies such as Social Security, disability, insurance, pensions, and worker compensation. She recently testified before a House committee about the alternatives to a four-year college education and the need for increased vocation education. And she's joining us today to discuss that very topic. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Elaine.
Well, this is such an interesting topic. I know we spent a couple minutes before we started recording, but this is a crisis that people, I think, don't realize there are so many layers to. Can you kind of start from the premise of the crisis?
Yeah, so we have kind of two crises in the U.S. before we even talk about the education part of it. We have a demographic crisis where we have an aging population and a declining fertility rate. And then we have a fiscal crisis where we have a massive amount of debt and no plan in place to fix it. And so we have this generation of younger people today who is smaller than it has been in the past. And they are going to be called on to be producing more than their prior generations so that they can support that aging population. And at the same time, they're going to have to be paying more to cover the debts of these past generations. And so the stakes are incredibly high for today's younger workers. And unfortunately, for many decades, the notion has been, and what has been taught in the K-12 schools, is your pathway is a four-year degree after high school. Like that's, the one track that you should be pursuing. And we have de-emphasized the other options that are out there that are, quite frankly, in many cases now even more promising than a four-year degree, depending on the field. And so it is moving in the right direction for sure. And there's positive momentum that we're seeing, but a lot more could be done.
Well, it's interesting. We at Job Creators Network have talked about the four-year degree versus going into vocations and the trades for a long time. Because of even like the minimum wage mandates and how the Democrats, talk about a living wage, but it's really an issue of we have a skills gap in this country. We don't necessarily have a wage gap. And when we start looking at how people can earn more, it's about getting people trained through better training programs, vocations, starting early in high school, even middle school, and catching them then in terms of their interests, and putting them on that path because you can't just keep paying somebody more to work in, say, fast food, which granted, I know that's a hard job. In terms of, but in terms of skill, it's not an electrician or a plumber. And so those are things that we address in terms of the government mandates that we keep seeing increase these minimum wage laws that really hurt our small business owners because they're working on such smaller margins. They're not big corporations. You see Walmart paying, $15 an hour to work at Walmart. Well, that doesn't mean that a small business owner can necessarily take on that when they don't have, high skills jobs. And so they tend to just not hire as many people and have less people doing more.
Exactly. And that's an unintended consequence of the minimum wage. No matter how good the intentions are, if the outcomes aren't there that you're desiring, then it's not a good policy. And that's exactly what we see with the minimum wage. Yes, the bigger companies, Walmart, Amazon, they can automate their way out of higher minimum wages and they can just transition those jobs, but the smaller companies can't do them. And so longer term, if we want workers to have higher wages and for them to be on an upwards trajectory, they have to be producing more. No employer, regardless of how small or big you are, can pay a worker more than the value of what they produce, or else they will go out of business and they will have no jobs to offer. And so we need to be focused on how do we get, starting very young, middle school, high school, how do we get people equipped to be able to produce the things that will warrant that higher paying job. And that's where we need to see more of like the career technical education being options in the high schools, more apprenticeships coming out of high schools as opposed to a 4-year college degree. Yes, in many instances, a college degree does pay off, but because there has been so much money thrown at the traditional 4-year degree, hundreds of billions of dollars coming from Washington in subsidies, the value has actually declined over time. And we're at a point now that a third of the degrees that people are getting have a negative return for them. And moreover, too many people are being pushed into college for whom it's not actually the best option. It's a kind of stunning statistic, but only 60% of students who enter college graduate within 6 years.
Wow.
So at least 40% are going into college, taking on debt that they're going to have to pay back afterwards, and not coming out with the degree that helps them to get that higher wage. And so let's focus more on apprenticeships and all of these other pathways that individuals can pursue that's like hands-on training. And oh, by the way, you don't have to pay 6 figures. You actually get paid while you are in this position. But there are really too few opportunities out there, and that's because there's just massive red tape on those types of programs.
Well, I remember, and I didn't get a chance to go back and look at my notes, but from the first Trump administration, there was a program that provided grants for companies to bring in folks and help train them. And if I recall correctly, are you familiar with that at all?
There might have been some smaller grants. I think the best thing that the first Trump administration does was to look holistically at this apprenticeship program. And yes, apprenticeships have been very successful in America, but because there's this government monopolized government registered apprenticeship program, it's really the only type of apprenticeship program that exists, but there's tons of red tape and bureaucracy around it. And so it has never been able to expand outside of the traditional male-dominated trades, when the reality is we need more nurses, we need some higher tech skills jobs. And these are things that you don't need a 4-year degree, you need the practical on-the-job training. And so the first Trump administration said, hey, let's allow this alternative model. We're going to call them industry recognized apprenticeship programs. So employers in an industry were able to get together and they were able to establish their own apprenticeship systems. They still had to be approved through the Department of Labor. They still had a lot of standards that they were following. And this is where we saw over 130 of these programs start up, predominantly in the nursing field, where we have massive shortages. And then the Biden administration came in and they canceled the programs. And then they issued a new regulation that was over 800 pages long in the initial proposal to put these new mandates on apprenticeship programs. There were over 800 instances of the word requirement in this proposed regulation that they fortunately never finalized. But this would have wiped out some of the existing programs, less yet made it all the more difficult for any new ones to have started up.
Interesting. So some of these industry and more high tech, I also recall reading that actually Google was doing some tech apprentice positions as well to help train in technology. I mean, that you would think would be very welcomed under even the Biden administration, but certainly under the Trump administration. Are you seeing large corporations take a lead like that? I mean, I know Google had a big PR effort behind what they were doing.
We are. Google, IBM, many others, they're not always necessarily a formal apprenticeship program because, as I said, that is kind of a big barrier to cross, but they're doing these training programs and their workers can come out with like an industry recognized certificate that is, an indicator of what they have learned in that program. Another one is called FAME, Federation for Advanced Manufacturing Education. And so it was originally started by one company, Toyota, in 2010, but then the industry as a whole took over it. And now they're partnering together and they have the students who enter the program can get both an associate's degree and their certificate in advanced manufacturing within 2 years. And that includes a lot of on-the-job training there. And when they compared the students who just had the associate's degree versus the FAME certificate, same amount of time, 90% of the FAME graduates were matched with the employer that they had worked with during their program. they're earning 50% more on their first year out. In 5 years out, they're earning 85% more. So this on-the-job practical training is a really important part of education that needs to be more prevalent.
Yeah, absolutely. In my past life, I worked in the automotive industry and for a supplier to the big three at the time. And I worked on bringing in the associations, the associations of like manufacturing, where our company was a member of a manufacturing association. And through that, we were able to tap into training programs that we would, and there was a grant through the state at the time, that we would bring in teachers from the trades it was a tooling association, who would teach at night in our facility for employees who were interested. I had to have so many employees interested in doing the training to actually qualify for the grant. And then, of course, I had to keep records on, who attended and how often, because we had to have regular attendance. But it was basically continuing education. So if you were a draftsman and you wanted to move to the next level, if you were, if you didn't have the drafting skills yet and you were interested, those classes were going on. So I had probably 3 to 4 classes a night going on at the same time in different areas of the company. I thought it was a great program. And there was about 250 people at the company at the time. And there was a lot of demand for it. I mean, they definitely wanted to improve their skills.
Well, that's exactly, a perfect success story of how you create that upwards opportunity for workers to be able to climb the ladder within the company itself. And that's what they need, is the education that gives them more skills to be more productive. And so I think it is great that we're seeing more employers taking this on themselves and actually making investments in the workers. There's definitely more that could be done to remove some of the red tape that often comes along with providing that education, but it's great news to see it happening.
How speaking of the red tape, how does some of the red tape and licensure requirements, how does that hamper the recruitment of industry experts to actually come in and do that teaching? Because I didn't have to deal with finding the teachers; the Tooling Association did, and it's not something I thought about until I started preparing for our discussion today, and that's that finding the teachers in industry to come in and teach that, whatever the trade is.
Yeah, many of the education programs can have these regulations where you have to meet very strict criteria that can box a lot of people who are very qualified and would do a great job teaching, can box them out. And, when we look economy-wide, the estimates of the burden of regulations is over $2.1 trillion on the economy. And so that comes out to $16,000 per household. And this plays down to workers and their wages as well, because when you think of a company, especially a smaller business, the impact of the regulations on them is always disproportionately large. And looking at like the manufacturing sector, the Association for Manufacturing has said that the average per employee regulatory burden is $29,000. So if every employer is spending $29,000 to comply with the regulations that are out there, that's $29,000 that does not go to them in terms of their pay and their benefits. And on the smaller manufacturers, it's $50,000. And so that's less that they can give to their workers. It's less money that they can use to invest in things where they could actually create more jobs and expand as a business. But it also goes over towards the actual teacher side, as you mentioned. And we are seeing, as a lot of high schools are, fortunately opening up more career technical education programs because there's the demand for it, they're unable to fill all of those because there aren't enough teachers that are able to take those jobs. And there's a combination of factors, but oftentimes it's because the compensation that they're offered is just not competitive with what they can make actually doing the job on the field. And that gets back to, well, why isn't the compensation enough? Well, because often it's determined by a teachers union that has set a pretty rigid pay scale that's based almost exclusively on the number of years of teaching experience and on your education level. Well, a lot of people who are out in the fields in these jobs probably don't have an advanced degree or a college degree. and they have 0 years of teaching experience. So they're going to start out at the very bottom rung of the ladder, even though they might have 2-3 decades in the field and be ready to kind of like step back and go into the classroom and teach the next generation. So there's got to be more flexibility from the unions on allowing kind of a different type of compensation structure so that you can get these individuals in.
Are all vocation and trade school do they all fall under teacher unions, or is it in specific states that are, strong union holds there in those states?
So it's
Go ahead.
If it's happening at the K-12 level, like in the high schools, then it's going to be subject to the union contracts there. And every state and even potentially every locality is different. Sometimes, at least on the credentialing side, because you actually have to be certified to become a teacher, there are, flexibilities that are given to those who have significant experience to be able to bypass some of the otherwise lengthy and costly certification parts of it. But yeah, at the K-12 level, it's having to go through the unions.
Broadly speaking, what are some of the ways that what are some of the recruiting methods to find people in industry, to even tap them and suggest coming out of industry to teach?
Well, there's not a whole lot at the K-12 level because, as I said, you're starting pretty low on the scales compared to somebody who's had a similar amount of time in the field teaching. But beyond that, it really does come down to the compensation packages and just being able to provide something that's competitive in terms of salary and benefits. One thing that would be great and very feasible for the K-12 is to look at the pension side, because pensions often make up 20% or more of teachers' compensation. And if you're talking about getting somebody who's been working in the trades for 20, 30 years to come in and to be a teacher for maybe the last 5-10 years of their career, they're not interested in the pension. They already have one of their own, and it would take them probably at least 10 years to vest in the teacher's pension system.
Uh-huh.
So that's of almost no value to them. But nevertheless, a significant portion of their compensation would have to go to that pension contribution. So why not let them have a choice to say, hey, I give up the pension. I'd rather take that in my paycheck. And then that might be enough to push them to be willing to take that job.
So that's in some of the challenges in the K-12 arena, where it falls under the teachers union and some of those requirements.
Mm-hmm.
What about just vocation schools in general and trade schools? If you wanted to go get your, electrician certificate or cosmetology license, nail
Mm-hmm.
tech license, any of those. What is happening in vocation schools across the country? Are they closing? Are they thriving? I feel like the demand's increasing, but I don't know that the supply is there.
Yep. So there's the formal apprenticeships, and then there's also, these licensed positions that have their own training programs. Across both of them, it's largely regulations that are preventing them from expanding more, but I would say especially so in the apprenticeship programs. This was a law that Congress passed that was not hardly even 2 pages long. And now we have hundreds of pages of regulations associated with it, down to like one of the most burdensome ones is when you require to have one worker for every student who's in the apprenticeship program. Well, we don't require that of teachers at K-12. We don't require that of colleges where we're sending hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies. And yet we mandated on these apprenticeship programs to have these really low ratios that make it that they can't admit more students into them. I mean, certainly more than one student could be following around, a worker in the field. And so it's really getting to those regulations and making it less burdensome. Unfortunately, the Biden administration proposed to do things like eliminate all apprenticeships that were built on anything other than hours. And so they said, you can't just measure whether or not people have learned the skills, competency type apprenticeship programs. You actually have to have 2,000 hours of in the classroom training. Well, that makes it incredibly costly for an apprenticeship program that's already operating. Maybe they only have $800 of classroom training and they have 2,000 in the field, but now they have to add another 1,200 hours on in order to comply. So it's things like this that are just making it all the more difficult for the existing apprenticeship programs to continue operating, to be able to accept more students into them. And certainly for anybody who would like to start an apprenticeship, I know when I went to read these regulations, I got to page 3 out of 800, and I thought, who would ever want to do this? There's just so many requirements, and it potentially open up the door to a lawsuit every other page that you turn. So there just needs to be less red tape. Yes, there are some things that are necessary to protect the student's safety, but not the hundreds of pages of regulations that are out there.
Right.
And on the licensure side, that's predominantly states decide which occupations have to require a license and how much is required. But really, it's within the industry, we see that there's kind of this, those who are already in the field want to have higher licensure requirements to prevent anybody else from coming out. So it's a kind of anti-competitive notion. But we are seeing some promising changes in states that are like at least universally recognizing licenses that have been earned in another state. So if a worker moves to one, they will accept their license.
I was just going to ask about the licensing reciprocity. I know I'm in Florida. Florida does licensing reciprocity with most states. I noticed that California doesn't seem to have as many states that do reciprocity, mainly because they don't do any. And so I think it's if you're not going to play in the sandbox, and I assume it's because they probably want to get the fees associated with new people coming into the states. But I was out I worked with Governor Ducey when he was governor of Arizona, when they were moving to licensing reciprocity. It was probably 9 years ago. But and it was a big deal because they were they were doing licensing reciprocity across the board. And it was a big deal to see that state go through that as well. I mean, he did a great job, obviously, in that area.
Yeah, it's great to see states like Arizona and Florida, and now many others are seeing that it's been a success and that it's actually drawing workers and employers to those states. And meanwhile, California has one of the most hostile environments for workers and employers alike. And, they say that they're trying to protect workers and to have higher wages and better jobs. And the reality is they're losing their jobs. Things like a $30 minimum wage is being proposed ahead of the Olympics being held there. That's going to create a terrible situation for all of the people who are going to be coming, the tourists, into the Olympics. And it's not going to end up resulting in more jobs. It's going to be higher costs for the people who are the customers. It's going to cut jobs off for those who are at the lower end, who have less education, less experience. And it's also going to result in exacerbating the pace towards automation and just getting rid of some of those jobs completely, driving more employers out of the state. The U-Haul records show how so many more people are leaving California than coming into California. If you won't even give somebody a license to work when they've been proven that they're licensed in another state, you're clearly not inviting them in.
Well, I know, not to get too much off topic, but on the licensing reciprocity, it also really hurts the spouses of the military, military spouses who have to move with their spouse because of where the government is putting them. And so if they are moving from state to state to state, there was, at the time, that was one of the motivations behind Governor Ducey's move, was the veterans or military spouses, because the unemployment rate for military spouses was much higher than the national average. And so if you had a spouse who was, say, a cosmetologist or something like that, and they had to move to a different state to start all over and go through the licensing for cosmetology or any of those certificate type trade or skills, it's a long process and it's costly when you're moving every 2 years with the military. And so that's a big cost and a big burden that, here you've got somebody who's committing to the military for the country, but their spouse can't get a job.
Exactly. And you've, highlighted one of the sets of individuals who are most negatively impacted by these licensure laws is the military spouses who have to move regularly. And think of somebody who's gone through significant education and training and paid all the fees, and they're a nurse in one state, and yet they get to another one, and then they have to go through potentially a year or more of additional training and paying thousands of dollars just to do the job that they already knew how to do. So certainly we need to see more of this happening across the states, but also there are many instances where licensure laws are just not necessary at all. Obviously, for nurses, they're necessary, but maybe not so for cosmetologists, certainly not so for florists or for dance instructors. I mean, these are things where the individuals, the customers who are purchasing those services or those goods can make a decision of their own based on the product and the service, whether or not it's something that, the individual is qualified to provide that. Interior designers, bartenders, like there's hundreds and hundreds of occupations that require a license that really all you need to do is look at the product and the service they're providing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was an interesting project to work on. Um, I'm just curious, what uh, federal or state policy changes do you propose to attract more folks to actually practice into those teaching roles? Because you can sort of see the domino effect. If you've got fewer teachers, you've got fewer students enrolling, and then what do you have? You have obviously a deficit in employees for those jobs, and so then you start to see the upward pressure on wage inflation. It's really a crisis in the making.
Mm-hmm. And so starting with what it requires to be qualified to be that teacher, and often it's a credential, a certification, a license. And so really looking at those and paring down to what is absolutely essential to require and allowing flexibility beyond that, especially as there's, when you talk about not just classroom teaching, but various, across the trades, there's so many different areas. It doesn't make sense to have a one size fits all standard for those. And so there has to be more flexibility on who is allowed to be in these positions. And then just greater flexibility, as I noted, on the compensation. It has to be a wage that's competitive with what they're able to make out in the field to instead come in and to be teaching. And so on that, I'd say you have to be able to go outside the traditional union rigid pay scales and also offer them a defined contribution retirement account as opposed to just the pension system that they might be losing their contributions to that.
What about paying for trade schools? Right now as parents, we can put away, into 529 plans. Are those plans, can those same plans be used for trade schools, for cosmetology school, any of those vocational type certificates? Or are we not there yet?
We weren't there at all. There's a step taken so that 529 plans can be used for some of these shorter term vocational training programs in the most recent One Big Beautiful Bill that passed. But certainly more could be done. But in reality, a lot of those programs, the individuals are getting paid to be in them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really comes down more to just getting rid of the regulations so that there is a greater supply of those out there so that more individuals can fill the spots.
Interesting. I remember Job Creators Network is founded by Bernie Marcus, the co-founder of the Home Depot. And I remember Bernie would talk to me about how the company was first founded and what their approach was to find people in the trades to actually work in the aisle that was selling plumbing supplies and electrical supplies and carpenters to work, selling the wood. And so they wanted to have real industry people in those aisles selling those goods. So they were obviously out recruiting people from those aisles as well. And you can still find people who are from the trades who are managing those departments as well. But I assume that it's the same type of challenge to find folks who want to come out of the trade if they've got that 20, 30 years experience.
Exactly. It has to be a job that is appealing to them and a compensation package that's appealing. But when you think about that in the story of Home Depot, that makes sense because you can get, the wood or the nails or the glue or whatever it is that you need at multiple different places. What would make you be more willing to go to a particular store and potentially even pay more if you have somebody who's knowledgeable there who can tell you this is exactly what you need. And no, you don't have to waste your money on that. And so it's just about, getting back to what we started here, how do individuals become more valuable? And the employers want to attract those individuals, the workers who are able to add that value to the product and the services they're selling.
Yep. Hence the invention of the DIY classes at Home Depot. Were taught by people right out of industry to teach you how to lay tile or, change the pipes under your sink, things like that. that were so helpful. So neat breakthroughs.
Yeah, and this is getting a little bit off on the side of this, but talking about that adding more value. And we look at, one of the things that's often talked about in terms of like more good jobs need to be available. We need more upwards trajectories. And some people will say, well, we need more unions so that, you can get these better jobs and better compensation. But really, it's about whether it's the union or the employer providing those things that will add value to the worker, that will help them to become more productive over time. And so that's why I see it as unfortunate that the unions have actually turned away from that, and they're often more involved in the politics and just mandating these compensation structures and workplace rules that end up making the company less competitive instead of more competitive. And I think if they could instead focus more on what can we do to make our workers become more productive so that they can earn more income over time, that would be a lot better outcome.
I was in a non-union company, the one I referenced. We did the classes for the employees at night, and they there was demand for the classes, obviously, but what kept us in check as far as making sure we were paying the best wages, offering the best holidays and the best 401k packages is the fact that there weren't enough people. And so I was competing with the shop down the street when I was interviewing somebody, and that's what kept us in check. And that's how we weren't unionized, because those employees didn't want to be unionized. They wanted to be able to demand as much as they could based on their skill level and the competitiveness of their skill. In terms of, like, I was competing and 3 other shops down the street were competing for that skill set. And so they had no desire to be unionized.
Exactly, because most workers want to be paid based on what they're bringing to the table and the value and contributions that they're not making or that they're making, and they don't want to be paid just based on this step scale that says you've been here for this many years. And so I think that the unions need to be willing to compromise on that as well, and to have more market-driven pay and allow employees to be rewarded for the fruits of their labor instead of doing the opposite and actually penalizing and saying that companies cannot even do things like have performance-based bonuses that go above and beyond the union pay scale. So I think it is unfortunate to see the ways that a lot of the unions are taking these one-size-fits-all approaches and actually hurting the workers they say that they're trying to help.
Yeah, it is a shame. Well, I'm wondering if you can tell everybody where we can learn more about you and the work you're doing at Heritage.
Yep, you can just go to heritage.org and look up Rachel Greszler. I've been doing a lot of work on what's been happening in the labor market, some of the trends that are out there. And so just look into that research. As I have noted, there is a troubling decline in the number of younger workers who are employed in the U.S. today. We see about 4.5 million fewer people between the ages of 16 and 24 working now that we did compared to 2000. And these are the individuals that need to be getting their first jobs and stepping out into careers and building those high-paying, good careers for the future.
Yeah. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for taking the time to talk to our audience on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast from, and we'll be back soon with another episode. Bye for now.